So this week we're talking about the liturgy. We're talking about the Catholic Mass. All right. So I'm going to take you through a few different aspects of that. But at any point, if you have a question or want to know more about something, please just raise your hand and interrupt me. Okay. First off, one of the unique things about Catholic worship is that it's based in ritual. And if you didn't grow up Catholic, maybe you grew up in a non-denominational setting, or maybe no worship, coming to a Catholic Mass, it could be a little bit weird, right? And why are they doing all these things, right? They're not always talking. The priest is like doing these gestures and moving around, and there's these odd clothes, and we're saying these call and responses back and forth. Okay, it could be a little strange if you're just stepping into that. So I think the first place to start with this is why ritual? There are other, like I said, denominations that don't really have as much emphasis on ritual. Maybe it is kind of following a standard pattern, right? They might have a talk, or a pastor might preach, they might have music, some type of greeting, but definitely not as heavy into the ritual as we are. So let's unpack that a little bit. What exactly is a ritual? Why would we do it? And why would we hang on to these old rituals that may not be immediately obvious as to their meaning? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Yeah.
I guess the reason why we have so many rituals and the reason why we carry on our rituals is because it's the way that we were taught to follow God, to be close to God, and to be close to Jesus. Because as Roman Catholics, or as Catholics, we are following what we believe, or rather what we know is the true way that Christ wants us to live our lives. And in accordance with that way, we follow these traditions. This is how we worship Him, and this is what He expects of us to do.
Okay. What if I responded back and said, I agree, but shouldn't we update them for our time so they're more relevant to modern day people?
If you want to respond, at least for my personal opinion,
Yeah, sure.
It would be worshiping God is timeless. While you can update some traditions, there's, I guess I don't want to sound old, but there's a reason traditions work for a reason. They are a tried and true method tested by our predecessors on how they lived their lives. And so I think it is an example that we should follow.
Okay, great answer. Great answer. Yeah, I think I saw your hand.
So the reason I do a lot of rituals is because the priest at the Mass, he's, like for example, with the liturgy of the Eucharist, he's consecrating the host. He's quite literally bringing the body, blood, soul, divinity of Christ into the Mass with us.
Okay, and if we forgot or lost that ritual, we couldn't do that, right? That's a good point. Yeah.
Like when we were at the beginning, we talked about like big T tradition versus like little T tradition.
Yeah.
So it's like there's certain parts where it's like this is like big T tradition, and there's other parts where it's like I don't know, a more personalized expression of like this method of worship, I guess, because there's different like even within the Catholic Church, there's different like churches, not churches, like particular ways of worshiping.
Yeah. Okay, great point. All right, big T tradition, little T tradition. Some aspects of the liturgy do change, right, even from parish to parish. Sacred Heart is definitely more on the, I guess, traditional side of that liturgical spectrum. So that's something we should come back to before class is over. All right, great points. And I think y'all kind of nailed it. If you think about like the most important things in our lives, whether that's your beliefs like we're talking about, or whether that's our loved ones or experiences that we've had, there's something kind of in common with all those things, and that is, we can lose them or they can fade over time, right? Our loved ones pass away, our memories kind of get dulled a little bit of things that we experienced that we would want to hang on to if we could. Our beliefs, right? They're not really tangible things, right? They're ideas that we hold on to. Our predecessors, right? For thousands of years of time's gone by, like time keeps going on, and we are in danger of always forgetting them. So if you think about it, what is a ritual per se, or more technically, a ritual is a way that we hold on to the most important aspects of our life. If you think about it, we take something intangible and we incarnate it, so to speak, into something tangible, physical, which we can do over and over and over and over again as many times as we want throughout time. And that tangible action reminds us, it keeps that intangible reality alive. So our loved ones, right, passed away. We do this naturally, right? We keep pictures of them because I don't want to forget their face. Or hopefully, if we're recording of them, right, you can keep that and listen to that so you don't forget their voice. In a certain way, that's kind of like a ritual. Even as a country, we have holidays where we're remembering events in history and what those events mean to us. And think of the 4th of July. Why are we going spending money on fireworks and just like blowing our money, lighting stuff on fire, shooting it in the air? All right, because that's supposed to represent, the bombs and the guns and the sacrifice of our forefathers who fought for our freedom. And so every year, to ingrain that into our minds, we do these rituals to keep that spirit alive. I'm sure at the Citadel, y'all have rituals that I don't know about regarding the school, right? That you probably do to keep that cadet spirit or Citadel spirit alive from class to class to class. Okay, so yeah, think about it as one mode which we can preserve the past. So I like that comment, because think about, it's been 2,000 years. I can't really wrap my head around that length of time, but 2,000 years since Christ left us, basically. But yet, the Mass, the Church, still goes on very much unchanged, which is kind of crazy to think about. It's my understanding the Church is the oldest institution that's still continually living in the world. So rituals are very, very important. And somebody made the point, right? If we change them, then we would lose that. So it's really like our anchor into the past, our tether into the past. And so we keep these rituals sacred, the big T tradition sacred and unchanged, so we have that connection. Good. All right, the other week when we were talking about why the incarnation, we kind of went through scripture and we sort of ended with Christ's sacrifice on the cross. But I think a point was made that is directly connected with our understanding of Mass. Can anybody, if they want to, just unpack that connection between Christ's death on the cross and our worship at Mass? Yeah.
So my understanding, like Mass, it's all like leading up to the Eucharist. So
Okay.
you start with like Christ's teachings and you learn about the gospel and like what he did, and then at the end of Mass you receive the Eucharist, much in the same way that Christ in his life taught, and it all led up to his death and crucifixion.
Yeah, that's a great point. And a lot of spiritual writers have made the observation that the Mass is kind of like a summary of Christ's life, from him processing, the priest processing in, to think about him processing into Jerusalem, or if you want to think about the readings as like his time of public teaching, right, and then leading up to the sacrifice, the communion. That's a great point. Yeah.
So with rituals, or with Christ on the cross and Mass, right? Like when we take the Eucharist, like Christ is the sacrifice of Mass, right? Christ on the cross is not, the end all be all, right? It's an ongoing sacrifice, so every single time necessary.
Good. Okay. And I think that's a really good point. It was a historical event, but it's also like this divine, mystical event, right? That's still alive. And at the Mass, we're kind of like tapping into that again and again and again. Okay. What I wanted to mention was, if you think about the sacrificial victim we talk about in the Old Testament, from the innocent, remember talking about like why kill innocent creatures for the sacrifices in the temple, for example. But then we were saying how that's the whole point, because they're innocent and they're taking on the sins of the people, so they die in the people's place. And then we were saying how at the Last Supper, Christ inserts himself into the place of the lamb, and he calls himself the sacrificial lamb or sacrificial victim. I think that's really the best place to start when thinking about what worship is for us. What more or what better thing could we do than to, like Christ, offer his sacrifice to God the Father? And I think that's essentially what the Mass is. Leading out of the Passover, Christ is the new Passover. And so every Mass, we are offering this sacrifice of the Son through the priest back to God the Father, because that is the perfect and consummate offering that could ever be made. So I think in that context, once you kind of get that idea down, a lot of other things fall into place as far as the details. We sing, right? But our singing or our prayers are imperfect before God, right? What does that offer God, really? Unless it's united to the sacrifice of his Son. So that idea of sacrifice, Christ the sacrificial victim, is really central to our worship. And so one of the things we'll talk about briefly is the direction that the priest faces at Mass. Only very recently has the priest changed direction. But for most of the church's history, the priest faced east along with the people. We both faced the same direction, because the idea was the priest in the person of Christ as the Son is offering himself to the Father, and we're participating in that. So both of us together are looking towards the Father in offering this worship.
Why is it based in the east?
So in the early church, there was a really, really big emphasis on facing the east. We've kind of forgotten this, unfortunately, in our time, but maybe that's a good question. Why so much emphasis on facing east? Yeah.
I would assume because east is where the Holy Land is, Jerusalem, Nazareth, where basically Jesus taught. That would be my guess.
Okay.
Could be wrong.
What if we're geographically where it would be west of us, though? I think they'd still face east.
Sunrises.
Okay, good. Yeah, all right. What's significant about the sun rising?
The sun rising.
Good. Yeah, the idea that, all right, the sun rises in the east. What's the heart of our faith? Christ has risen from the dead. That justifies the whole thing, like St. Paul says. If that's not true, then none of it's true. All right, so the early Christians were really big on that. Even Pope Benedict, he has a famous book called The Spirit of the Liturgy. And in the early church, like 300s, 400s, when St. Peter's was first built, I guess whatever way they built it, they decided to put the altar over the bones of Peter, but it ended up having the church kind of flipped as it normally would have been, facing the wrong direction. But he says even then, the idea of facing east was so important that the priest and the people faced east, even though the altar was behind them, and the priest was behind them and behind the people. So it was an important thing in that early liturgy. Later on, like around the Renaissance, you have this idea of liturgical east, meaning they stopped building churches towards actual east, and as long as the priests and people faced the same direction, it was considered okay. And then more recently, we've kind of totally forgotten the idea. So maybe that's something, yeah.
Isn't there also something about the second coming of Christ to look to the east, that we're looking, facing the direction that he supposedly is to return from?
Yeah, yes.
I thought I heard that somewhere. I can't remember where, though.
Well, I think a lot of the imagery, like in the Gospels and also the liturgy, like we talk about at Advent, right? The first and second comings are always kind of layered with each other. And so facing the east because of the resurrection, but then also looking towards the second coming of Christ. That's a great Great point. Okay, so yeah, let me walk you through just a rough outline of how the liturgy developed. Oh yeah, question.
So in like past masses, would the priest be like facing away from the gospel and stuff?
Um, so the Tridentine Mass, which was kind of formalized in the 1500s and kind of reflects the Mass of the Middle Ages, the epistles are read facing away from the people because the book is on the altar, the priest is facing the altar. And the gospel too, unless it's like a solemn mass, and then they would take the gospel off the altar and they would walk over to the northern part of the church, and the priest would actually read the gospel facing north. And in the Roman Rite, that had to do with very early on converting the barbarians of the northern Europe. So symbolically preaching the gospel towards them, and that just kind of stuck. But yeah, if it's not solemn mass, the priest will read it off the altar. That makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so we've already kind of established the roots of our worship are in the Last Supper, right? Jesus putting himself as the sacrificial victim. Okay, what was it like? What was it like in the early church? Because even in Acts of the Apostles, it mentions that they celebrated the Eucharist. They broke bread every day, even in the early church. So early on, in actually 1 Corinthians, we get a little bit of a record of the Mass because there's some problems that are happening. And Paul has to correct the Corinthians. First, because there's people who are drunk at Mass. So that's interesting. But then also, too, we get a glimpse into the early Mass in that when they celebrated the Eucharist, they'd also include some of the meal aspect from the Passover. So they wouldn't just have the Eucharist. People would bring food and also eat together. And St. Paul has to kind of chastise some of the wealthier people who are bringing nice food while some of the poor members of the community don't have anything to eat and are just kind of sitting there. And so, yeah, that doesn't last too long, though. Pretty quickly, that other eating part kind of drops out, and it just really becomes focused on the Eucharist itself. Now, in the clandestine church before Constantine, they couldn't build a churches like we have in public, so they had to celebrate Mass sometimes in the middle of the night. They had to go to different people's homes, or literally underground into the catacombs where the dead were buried, because these are places where they could do it secretly, basically, without being caught. And so this was kind of the idea of almost like a house church, but they would gather again for the breaking of the bread. And the basic structure of the Mass, even at this time, is already kind of set. And we get a glimpse of this actually in Acts of the Apostles, because it says they devoted themselves to the prayers, the teaching of the apostles, to the breaking of the bread. And one more thing, which is escaping me. But if you think about it, it's basically the same structure we have now. We have the teaching of the apostles with the liturgy of the word, right? We read the apostles' letters. We have prayers, which kind of are throughout the whole thing. We have the breaking of the bread with the liturgy of the Eucharist and with communion. So the basic structure has always kind of been there, but it's going to change a little bit, especially this time in these house churches, they're speaking Greek. So actually the origins of the Roman Rite were actually in Greek. And so there's a little bit of a holdover of that. You think we say the Kyrie eleison? That's actually not Latin. That's a Greek phrase. So that's just a tiny clue of what that was like. But later on, as the Roman Empire is kind of falling, Greek kind of falls out of really widespread knowledge. And so that's when the liturgy shifts to Latin. Latin more of like the vulgar or common language of even the poorer people. And so right around scholars say somewhere like the 300 to 400s in there. The Greek liturgy changes into Latin. Now, after Constantine, thankfully, they can actually build physical public churches to worship in. So that's obviously going to change things a little bit from meeting in like somebody's cramped room or something. So there's definitely more space. Kind of moving into the medieval period, which is a long period of time, as they begin to build these very large churches, the liturgy changes a little bit. And this is what some people, I think, objected to with the changes at Vatican II. In a very big church, right, you have a lot of space. And they didn't really use kneelers. Kneelers are only like from the last 150 years. People would be kind of free to move around as they wanted. And so often the priests would be sort of at one end in the sanctuary, and the people would be sort of separated. And you could be kind of far away to the point where they came up with the ringing of the bells because they wanted to know when the consecration was going to happen so they could kind of snap to attention and like really come in and focus. But nevertheless, the medieval period, I think, is one characterized by piety, a deep, deep reverence for the liturgy. So they developed the idea of tabernacles, right? At first in the early church, they would consume all the Eucharist. And then as they began to save some of it, there's early records of tabernacles, which they made like these gold birds to symbolize the Holy Spirit, and they put the Eucharist in that. But again, later as they're building these large churches, they develop what we know now as like a modern day tabernacle where they could reserve the Eucharist. You could go to pray. This is when they came up with the idea of adoration. Hey, I want to see the host, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. So let's make something where we can display it and we can all come and pray and receive grace just from seeing the Eucharist. People wanted to get a glimpse of the Eucharist so bad that they forced the priest. This is where the elevation of the Mass comes from. There's a funny story of them kind of accosting this priest, hey, lift it higher so we can see, lift it higher. And so that actually caught on, right, where the priest lifts it, would be over his head so you could see from behind him instead of just like that. So yeah, a deep level of reverence and piety. And over this long period, what kind of happens is you have this accumulation of more and more prayers. Okay, so the liturgy lengthens and kind of expands. And that's another thing Vatican II they're going to have to address. What do we do with some of the prayers that may be kind of repetitive or too long, where the priest is sort of speeding through them because it's like so much to say? But they also, at that time, didn't really limit themselves to an hour, right? We tend to think of Mass like, okay, it's got to be an hour. If it's over an hour, like, I got to get out of here. Got to get out of here. It's too long. But I think life obviously was a bit slower in previous times. And so if the prayers were longer, the priest still said them. Okay, the medieval period, again, like I mentioned, is kind of formalized when the Protestant Reformation happens. Okay, so the Catholic response to the Reformation, obviously with the Council of Trent, with the Counter-Reformation in the 15 and early 1600s, the Pope at that time, I believe is Pius V, but don't quote me on that, was a Dominican, and what he wanted to do, at least in Europe for the Roman Rite, was to take all the different versions that had developed on their own and kind of universalize it. So there were different rites, like for example, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Benedictines, they all had their own version of things. But any of the rites that were not like over 200 years old, he kind of said, I want you to use this sort of like universalized version of the Roman Rite. So that's where we get the term Tridentine Rite from the Council of Trent, and then kind of formalizing what the Mass should look like for the Roman Rite. But the Tridentine Mass is still very much an expression of the Middle Ages, a deep piety. There's a lot of silence in it. There's a lot of prayers in it. There's a lot of time for personal contemplation. The priest isn't necessarily doing things so that you can see it. He's doing things for the purpose of worship. And if you see it or not, that's dependent on you, I guess. But nevertheless, from the 1500s to the 1960s, the Tridentine Rite is all across the Western world. So whether that's in Europe, or at least Western Europe, North America, South America, even other places where missionaries of the Roman Rite took it to Africa or other areas. So again, it's pretty universalized, and you still kind of get a sense of that today. The Roman Rite is by far the biggest. Okay, but anyway, so that kind of holds sway all the way up until the 1960s, and this would be kind of our most recent liturgical reform at the Second Vatican Council. And this is one that I think is interesting because the fruits of it are still kind of being debated today. So in the 1960s, there's a lot of things that changed societally, from mass transportation, right, to global communication, to globalized economy, sort of humanity having a greater awareness of this universal brotherhood, human rights, all those types of things were happening. And so at the Second Vatican Council, they're very concerned with the idea of how does this very, very medieval church dialogue with the changing modern world and enter into this very modern world. And one of the things that they did was look at the liturgy and make some reforms to the liturgy in order, I guess you could say, to make it more palatable to the modern world. And so what did they do? Well, we have to first make a distinction between what the council wrote about changes they wanted made, and then what actually people on the ground in the 60s and 70s actually did. And those are kind of two very distinct things. So the council documents are still pretty conservative. There are some changes, for example, the use of some vernacular, like with the readings, for example. It's easier for people to hear the readings if they can understand them in their own language. A little bit more open to cultural sensitivity. If there's a particular way or expression of worship in different cultures that could be incorporated, that would be okay.